People seeing the beauty of this valley will want to stay, and their staying will be the undoing of the beauty. According to local folklore, that quote is attributed to Arapaho chief Nawat. It is true that Nawat peacefully asked a group of miners to abide by the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty and look elsewhere for gold so as to protect the Arapaho winter camp in what is now the Boulder Valley of Colorado. His request fell on deaf ears. What if contemporary Arapaho tribal elders who listened to stories from their ancestors about the Sand Creek Massacre were able to renew their cultural identities by returning to their homelands in Colorado? Over 3 years and continuing into the coronavirus-19 pandemic, I've talked with Southern and Northern Arapaho tribal members.
Because of that stone indicating Fort Chambers, and because that they had rallied there, it's important because it's a link to Sand Creek.
The tribes are talking about reparation from Sand Creek. In that reparation, they're looking at land.
Down there, we're whole. We had our own way. We done things our own way down in Boulder, on the Estes part of that area.
I just think that we do need to have continued government-to-government relationships, as well as the relationships that we're making right now, for them to continue on so that we can continue to do good things for our people and for ourselves to continue to educate our youth, so that they'll have a better understanding, because that's our future.
There's been a generation of us that have challenged many rules that have discriminated against the tribal membership. It's basically been a strong effort to marginalize the native populations.
Stereotypes for Native Americans, they're still very pertinent, right? Some people still believe we live in teepees, some people still, they think that there's nothing but drunks and woman beaters on the reservation. The dark history of America. They think that our people are ignorant.
And I would love to see that someday in Boulder, Arapahos from the south, Arapahos from the north would migrate back to Boulder and live on this land that we were intended to live on.
Eventually, we found out that in order to be able to acquire that education, understand it, and be able to work with it, that we had to be taught and we had to be learned by our values, our views. Over 600 years of contact, not one Indian has turned white.
My interest in this story goes back to my past life, when I worked for the Northern Arapaho tribe on the Wind River Indian Reservation in west central Wyoming. The friendships I made 30 years ago continue today. My past and present lives serendipitously collided in 2018 prior to an Indigenous Peoples Day celebration. I was contacted by a Boulder, Colorado-based nonprofit organization.
I co-direct a project that's called Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples. And I do this work with Geraldine Decoto. I am not a Native person, and Geraldine is. Geraldine is an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians.
The next steps are to continue the conversations that we've started and keep working on trying to find a suitable piece of land, and it might very well be this one, for the Arapaho to have a permanent place that they can come and do prayers and ceremonies, spend the night.
We've been working together for about 8 years. And so Geraldine and I were invited to participate in a process of drafting the text for what became an Indigenous Peoples Day resolution for the city of Boulder. Right Relationship Boulder grew out of that work.
Whereas Indigenous people in Boulder respect the interdependence of all humanity and living things and celebrate a vast and rich living tradition through ancestral recognition and diversity of knowledge and perspectives, including sustainable practices. And whereas Indigenous people in Boulder have, as in all parts of the Americas, endured centuries of cruelty, exploitation, and genocide. And whereas the Boulder area encompasses ancestral homelands of Indigenous peoples, nations, and whereas facing and acknowledging our past, good as well as bad, makes our community stronger and more resilient. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the City Council of Boulder, the second Monday in October of each year to be Indigenous Peoples Day.
And they said, well, Boulder Valley is our home. We'd love to have a place there. And as far as what they wanted to share with the people of Boulder Valley, they said, we would like them to know that we are still here, that we'd like to share with them the way we live today, the way we play today, and not just about our history, but our current lives as well.
Right Relationship Boulder started convening groups of people in Boulder, citizens, to see how we could support the city in implementing the Indigenous Peoples Day resolution, which calls on the city to lift up the presence and the history and the cultures and the contributions of Native people in this community in every possible way, through historical signage, through educational programs, through cultural programs and arts, and through the school system, and through every way that the city can become more aware of the history and presence of Indigenous people here.
Discrimination towards Indigenous tribes has been happening for parts of 5 centuries or more. Tribal populations were decimated when pioneers took the land on which tribes resided and subsisted upon without any notion of ownership by anyone. The Arapaho and other nomadic tribes roamed the Great Plains following herds of bison. Settlers seeking new lives drove the tribes from their traditional homeland to reservations where the United States military tried to strip tribal members of their language and culture. Racial discrimination and negative stereotyping are legacies of Western expansion. Beyond Sand Creek is about how the Arapaho are renewing their way of life by teaching their children the Arapaho language and the tribal culture. emphasizing past tribal presence within non-tribal communities will undo racism toward Indigenous people. Tribal elders link those efforts with repatriation of their traditional homeland that will result in a cultural pipeline from Wyoming through Colorado to Oklahoma. An example of this, Arapaho Language and Culture Commission member Wayne Seahair presented a short class on the Arapaho language at an Indigenous Peoples Day workshop.
I am Vaishnava. So I say, Nanani no, hustle no, okay. You say, Nanani no? Your name? Ingrid. Nanani no?
And. Tribes have been in conflict with European settlers from the moment the intruders set foot on what is now American soil since, I'll say, 1492.
Oh, Columbus sailed the ocean in 1492 with the Nina and the Pinta and the Santa Maria too.
Wayne's brother William is current chairman of the commission. I spoke to him about this at a commission meeting in Arapaho, Wyoming.
Way back when our people welcomed the pilgrims when they first come over, we were, linguistically speaking, we were from that area. We were on the East Coast, and that's where all the Algonquin people still flourish today. And I think the Arapaho were the furthest west of that language family.
Fast forward to the Transcontinental Railroad that was completed in 1869. The railroad made it easier for settlers to travel west. The U.S. Army protected the settlers and railroads from tribes only wanting to protect their homelands and their way of life, following the bison herds that were nearly exterminated by bounty hunters.
The stereotype of our people, has always been, that we were villains. We were in the way as a people to what they call progress, by discovery that whatever they come upon was theirs.
Many railroad rights-of-way are now abandoned. Right Relationship Boulder and the Arapaho are working with the Boulder County government to incorporate a tribal presence within the track bed. Interpretive signage presented with history and information in the Arapaho language would follow a route that extends from a ghost town called Valmont to Erie, just east of Boulder. Such efforts are small steps that help undo discrimination toward Native Americans, but it's an ongoing struggle. The news and popular media have portrayed negative images of tribal members for centuries.
With his faithful Indian companion Tonto, the daring and resourceful masked rider of the plains,
I came across a 1923 silent movie called The Covered Wagon that was considered to be an epic back in its day. The story is a stereotypical cowboys and Indians movie, but what's unique and relevant to the Arapaho story, director James Cruz wanted to depict the realities of the period. The storyline ironically perpetuates the tribal stereotypes that he wanted to avoid.
On my knees, I was flying to Louisiana, my true love for to see. It rained all night the day I left, the weather it was dry. The sun so hot I froze to death, Susanna, don't you cry.
But rather than hiring dark-skinned Latino, Filipino, or white actors in makeup, Cruz opted to hire actual Native Americans as extras for his film. Cruz chose a fellow named Ed Farlow from Lander, Wyoming, who had a good relationship with the tribes on the Wind River Indian Reservation. Farlow enlisted future cowboy actor Tim McCoy to recruit a few hundred Native Americans to be in his movie.
My old friend Chief Ulachi here, he's a Yakima. I was up here visiting him. He started to tell me a story in signs. And then he realized that you who were visiting with us probably didn't understand the signs, and that's what he was telling you in his own language. He was saying, I'll bet you don't know what we were talking about, do you? You know, this sign language of the Plains Indians is very interesting because you can talk to all the Plains tribes, and they'll all understand these same signs.
Farlow and McCoy traveled with their actors to Utah for the production. They paid their background actors the same rate as white actors. In addition to tribal member extras, Cruz hired hundreds of covered wagons at the rate of $2 per day to be in the movie. Wagon owner families also played parts in the film. The production included a huge herd of bison in a stampede scene. During the movie filming, 7 bison were killed. The covered wagon glorified Native Americans as savages.
In order to move more rapidly and advance further, therefore that's when they started this the system of annihilating these 4 that were impeding their progress. Indians, they started to be attacked just whenever and however, shot on sight, and also the grizzly bear, the wolf. And the buffalo.
Because of long-held cultural cues spanning more than 500 years, discrimination toward indigenous people continues today. Devin Oldman is the former Northern Arapaho Historic Preservation Officer.
Eventually, it transpired from viewing us as nations that were respected to nations who got in the way of resources, of land, of water, right? Anything that you can possibly think of that American society benefits from today, right? From being nations to that were friendly and had an understanding of each other's borders, of each other's way of life, of each other's protocol, it completely flipped to enemies of the state, right? Terrorists.
Eugene Ridgeley Jr. is a language and culture instructor at St. Stephen's School in Arapaho, Wyoming.
No dogs or Indians allowed, especially in the bars, even restaurants. It's like that Jim Crow scene, you know. My dad took me to town when I was a little kid, and there was a drive-in, you know, right by the old high school where they tore it down. And we couldn't go in. Instead, we had to park out in back, and my dad had a lady come out and took the order. Yeah, we couldn't go inside.
Based on their past experiences, Northern Arapaho elders still prepare the next generation by explaining how they may be treated by the dominant culture.
But back in our day, we were always told to be careful to go to town. And guys are powerful people. You know? We're just small people. They tell us that. My parents tell us that. So I grew up that way. You know? My grandpa said, hey, you better be careful to go to town. Dangerous there for you, they say. You might get hurt.
Gary Collins was chair of the Northern Arapaho Business Council and served as the tribal liaison to the state of Wyoming.
Well, it's interesting that I've had to think about that discussion with my dad, in that as I grew up, he didn't really relate a lot of things the Arapaho way to me. And here it is, 2020, and we're still fighting those same battles.
Today, I still think we're down here because of the way I was raised. So.
Yeah, he told us about it. He said, be careful. He said, don't ever trust a white man. He said, there's some there that's going to be against you, but they're going to kiss, like they want to kiss your ass, but they've got other intentions. Or they just flat out don't like you.
If you can understand what it was like coming out of World War II when the Eisenhower administration was prone to eliminating all reservations. And so there was a real surge to diminish native populations.
In 1956, the U.S. Congress established a new policy towards the Native Americans that eliminated government support for tribes and ended trust status of tribal lands. The Bureau of Indian Affairs began a voluntary urban relocation program. This was yet another step towards stripping tribal members of their identity. The BIA produced recruitment films that painted a very rosy picture of big city life.
The streets that once bewildered him are no longer confusing. He has begun to feel at home upon them. He has learned that Chicago's fast public transportation system is more convenient than his own car. That a bus stop is always within walking distance of his home, his job, his church, wherever he may be.
Hand in hand with defunding the reservations, tribal members could move from their rural homes to new ones in big cities like Chicago.
When the new arrival makes a preliminary choice, arrangements are made. Single men and sometimes single women may live at the YMCA Hotel at 826 South Wabash, where dozens of activities are sponsored to make life pleasant for people in the city.
The realities of urban relocation weren't always as they were presented.
What they did this time was try and convince us that there was great opportunities waiting for Indians in the cities. More than half of us believed it. It was because of this that me and Mike and our friend Carol Warrington ended up in Chicago.
The BIA pledged assistance with locating housing and employment.
Friendly Bureau staff helps them settle. Much is to be done on moving day. After the baggage is stored, location of grocery stores and bus stops must be determined. Rent payment schedules must be agreed upon with the landlord and keys obtained. Those moving into the more desirable unfurnished apartments must buy furniture. It is a long and tiresome day before the family will be settled in their new home.
Numerous Native Americans made the move, but struggled to adjust to city life.
In the ghetto, nothing ever really worked. Plumbing, the heat, everything was always broken down. I hated living here. Conditions were terrible, unlivable. We were buried alive. We had to do something. We had to find a way to show people how bad things really were. So we set up the first Chicago Indian village. You know,
when the newcomer is comfortably settled, he returns to the Bureau office to consider plans for earning a living. If he takes training before employment, he may, after visiting several of the city's excellent vocational schools, they practice with the most modern equipment until they are able to hold a steady office job almost anywhere in our country.
While there were tribal members who successfully adapted to city life, others faced unemployment from low-end jobs, discrimination, and the loss of traditional cultural support. But their negative effects continue among some urban tribal members.
The BIA, has unraveled the fabric of the community. So my hope is in the future is to put that fabric back together, get our young people involved in agriculture on resources that they own.
New beginnings for a culture that straddles two worldviews start with young people, such as this Bison Ceremony that took place on the Wind River Reservation.
It's a really important day today for all of us to be part of this activity here. It's not just another thing, it's something you should really pay attention to and respect. Respect Dickie John and his elder ways. And National Geographic was there and took pictures. So if you look in National Geographic back in 94, 95, you should see the same thing happening over there at Blue Sky.
This is my first buffalo.
Arapaho people maintain tribal ceremonies like sweat lodges that undo intentional cultural disruptions. The Arapaho Cultural Conduit would locate places for ceremonies on repatriated homeland. Getting ready to sweat at Harvey Spoon Hunters. Right Relationship Boulder is working as the community liaison between the Boulder Valley School District to connect Arapaho elders to the classroom.
This was an amazing event today here at Casey Middle School, where Casey was able to invite members and guests of the Arapaho tribes, northern and southern, to their building, and a chance to share culture, to share history, to share dance. It was really an exciting event. To at least have a single event like this for one day, but also to build the relationships, to begin to understand how we can better improve what we have in our curriculum and our curricular resources to help educate the students in Boulder Valley about Native people and about the Arapaho people too. The call for action is something that, as a school district, we know we can do a better job of representing the diverse student body that we have, and ensuring that the students that are in the chairs of our seats see themselves in the curriculum and in the resources and in the books and in the materials that we use to teach them. And specifically thinking about local history, knowing that we'd be mistaken to leave out knowledge and the voice of the Arapaho when we're talking about local history in this area.
I'm part of a tribe myself. I'm part of the Standing Rock tribe, so I am Lakota. And it was really cool because I wanted to meet new people, and I know that this is their home. And like them, I can relate because my tribe also had a massacre that's called Blue Creek Massacre. And so I guess I could say I do understand in some ways the way that they feel about being chased out of their home in some ways. I can't exactly say, but I'm just glad that they're back and that they get to see their home again. It's really great, and the dancing that they did was amazing, and it reminded me of my tribe, so that was really fun.
Before we started learning about the Arapaho, we had to do an activity of Native Americans, and I got really interested in the Arapaho for their beadwork, so that really got me into the Arapahos. I was with 2 women here who are sisters, and they were talking about their beadwork and the meanings behind their beadwork. And they were also talking about their stories of their grandparents and how it's been passed down through generations, and I found it all really interesting.
The results of this ongoing relationship filter down to the community at large to undo negative stereotyping, replacing those stories with how tribal members live today. Reversing negative stereotypes is a daunting task that begins with students.
I wish that everybody could understand more of the history of the Arapaho and many more Native American tribes, because they all have a really interesting story and it's something that we people should know about so that history doesn't get lost and that there's no more racism.
Arapaho tribal cultural programs are collaborating with Right Relationship Boulder to establish a language and culture camp that complements other tribal efforts, such as the Arapaho Safari.
Come on, do it with me.
An Arapaho virtual reality storytelling project.
Sing real freely, but before, because of the 500 years of stuff, like the ceremony we had over here in the Sundance, it was illegal, forbidden. We lost a lot of our ceremonies that kept us well, kept us healthy, because the white man said you can't do those.
Natives and Aboriginal people across the world were the inventors of abstract art. They were doing it way before Picasso and any of those guys ever even thought about.
Southern Arapaho legislator and cultural advocate Billy Sutton says that preservation of the Arapaho language is important to maintaining cultural traditions.
Our own kids need to get together and do it again. I want to see North and South back together again. We've been apart so long we've lost track of who our families are.
And so they had expressed an interest in having people from both the Northern Arapaho tribe in Wind River and from the Southern Arapaho in Oklahoma meet in the Boulder area and bring about 8 or 10 youth from each of those different areas, in addition to 8 elders who would meet with them, and they would be able to spend 3 or 4 days in this area, both feeling the area where they feel their roots are from, where they're connected to, and then learning about their language, their culture. They would learn cooking, they would learn other skills.
Teresa Hischase works through Right Relationship Boulder and connects the Northern Arapaho elders with the Boulder Valley community.
For a long time in our schools, then we didn't really get to learn about our own history, and a lot of it wasn't passed down from our family members for different reasons. But now we're trying to re-educate ourselves as to our history and save those stories that are still being told, so that we can find out more about us. Our children will have a sense of identity of who they are as Arapaho and why we do the things that we do.
What we were trying to do was help them make that happen, help facilitate that by raising money, finding a location, working with them to find what's the right setup for them to be able to do that. So we worked in conjunction and found a place to hold it, and it will happen.
The Arapaho tribes are reestablishing their cultural presence on their traditional homelands and building partnerships with local governments to return land back to the tribes.
Whereas in August of 1864, nearly 100 Boulder County residents mobilized into Company D of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry of U.S. Volunteers in Fort Chambers near 63rd and Belmont Streets to become Indian fighters.
Former Boulder Mayor Suzanne Jones was optimistic.
Well, I feel like we're finally getting to critical mass here with this conversation, and I feel like a lot of people here in the city are putting a lot of energy into this. The tribes are willing to trust that conversation and come together with us, and I think there's a real acknowledgement, an evolution, if you will, about just recognizing it's time for us to do something.
Elected tribal and city leadership changes every 2 years. Maintaining continuity is an institutional barrier. Regardless, Right Relationship Boulder is facilitating these efforts to repatriate land back to the tribes.
It's a challenge to bring together tribal people, Indigenous people who have their ways of doing things and who also don't live right here in Boulder, to bring them together with a city bureaucracy that is also accustomed to doing things its way. And so I think I see this as a challenge for the city to find ways of working within tribal protocols. And I think the city is doing its best to do that, to learn tribal protocols and to learn how to develop these relationships.
Right Relations is helping to hold the space for this conversation and move it forward. There's also a more formal tribal consultation process that is happening this spring, where we speak more formally to the tribes as sovereign nations, and also this conversation about lands. And so I think that will go forward. It's already on the work plan.
In the fall of 1858, a party of gold prospectors, led by Captain Thomas Aikens, trekked 30 miles from Fort St. Vrain on the way to Nederland, seeking precious metal ore. The fort was a place where tribal members could also barter their bison hides for supplies. Two businessmen, Charles Bent and Saron St. Vrain, formed the Bent St. Vrain and Company when they built the outpost at the confluence of the South Platte River and a tributary now called the St. Vrain Creek in 1830. The Aikens party pitched a camp on Boulder Creek near a rock formation now known as Valmont Butte. Chief Nawat and his closest braves galloped down to greet them when he asked them to leave. There continued to be tension, but Nawat relented, thinking that coexisting with the settlers was the only solution that would result in the Boulder Valley remaining undisturbed. Movies like The Covered Wagon romanticize settlers traveling west with stops at military posts like Fort St. Vrain and the U.S. Army providing protection along the way. Shortly thereafter, though, pioneers provoked the Arapaho, who responded in kind so as to protect their dwindling territory. The Colorado Territory took steps to address the conflicts among settlers and the Arapaho. The townspeople feared attacks by the tribes and built an earthen fort east of Boulder, later known as Fort Chambers. One pioneer was David Nichols. He came to the Boulder gold mining boomtown in 1859 and set up shop as a blacksmith. His granddaughter, Laura Webb, later recounted that her grandfather held racist views toward Native Americans, which may have been his motivation to become Boulder County Sheriff in 1863. Nichols later resigned to accept a captain's commission with Company D of the 3rd Colorado Volunteer Cavalry. Territorial Governor John Evans formed the Colorado 3rd in 1864 to punish the tribes viewed as hostile and force them out of the Colorado Territory. Cheyenne Chief One Eye negotiated a truce among the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and the U.S. government. According to the agreement, tribal members would be guaranteed safe winter camping along the nearby Sand Creek. One Eye had a daughter named Amache. She married a Colorado cattleman named John Prowers. The Camp Amache World War II Japanese relocation camp was named after her. Despite the pact, on November 29, 1864, around 750 members of the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes, in compliance with U.S. Army orders, were peacefully encamped along Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado. Despite waving American flags and raising white flags, the camp was surprise attacked by the Colorado 3rd under the command of Colonel John Chivington. Soldiers stormed the Prowers Ranch and held Prowers and Amache as hostages. After the attack, more than 150 tribal members were dead and their bodies mutilated. There were 650 troops that included the 100 volunteers of Company D, trained at Fort Chambers under the command of Captain Nichols. The fort was located on the outskirts of Boulder and very near to where Chief Nawat confronted the original party of miners heading to Nederland 6 years earlier. The ambush is known as the Sand Creek Massacre. The original site of Fort Chambers, now known as the Poor Farm located on 61st Street, is part of the City of Boulder Parks and Open Space program. The backstory doesn't end there. David Nichols, now a war hero, went on to be elected to the territorial legislature. Nichols was named Speaker of the House, where he was successful in getting the legislature to locate the University of Colorado in Boulder in 1875. David Nichols and his wife Elizabeth had 2 sons, Ezra and Horace. Horace married and had a daughter born in Boulder named Laura, after the 4 middle letters of Colorado. Her middle name was Webb. Horace moved his family to a ranch near Encampment in south-central Wyoming. Laura Webb worked for the local newspaper and became a well-known regional photographer. Laura Webb Nichols kept a detailed diary that provides insight about her grandfather's perspective about Native Americans. She writes, "Grandfather fought 4 battles with the Indians, one of them being that of Sand Creek, which will be remembered as the most sanguinary engagement. Many a time I heard my grandfather say emphatically, 'The only good Indian is a dead Indian.' His experiences with the noble red man very understandably prejudiced him against them. Although I have often heard him say when visiting with his cronies, considering the treatment the Indians receive from the white men, it is no wonder they show no mercy. I do not like to remember the anecdotes they told about the Indian atrocities, which were too awful to bear contemplation." Laura Webb Nichols separated from her grandfather's experiences and prejudice towards Native Americans. She turned her creative pursuits to photography. Her future husband, Bert Oldman, gave her a camera when she was 16. Arapaho elders are connecting tribal youth with their language and culture while integrating those efforts with their traditional land base.
We're in the process of trying to figure out how to rename Settlers Park. That's a gesture towards history, and how do we rectify some of the past inequities.
After a multi-tribal consultation, the Boulder City Council in 2021 changed the name to People's Crossing.
But then there is a conversation about, hey, let's look at our open space system. Are there lands that are sacred to the tribes that we could convey or some way acknowledge our ancestral homelands? And I think people are willing to have that conversation. And what would be meaningful to the tribes? What would be a homecoming, if you will?
Elvin Kenrick is a Southern Arapaho chief. He thinks that gaining access to the land is key to improving relations with the Boulder Valley.
There's land that has already been purchased from the city of Boulder, and the whole thing is to educate our community and to unite not only the local people in this community, but unite them with the Arapaho people.
And we're at the site of Fort Chambers, which is where the volunteer militia was mustered that went down and eventually committed the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. This is one of the City of Boulder open space properties that could possibly be used as a place where Arapaho and other indigenous peoples could reclaim a place here in the Boulder Valley. When Arapaho delegates came from Oklahoma and Wyoming in June, the city open space department brought us here to see this land.
Fort Chambers is no longer standing, but its memory is still alive. The Arapaho partnered with Right Relationship Boulder to help collaborate with local government and other landowners with the hope of returning land back to the Arapaho. Little did anyone realize how Fort Chambers and the Sand Creek Massacre would later be tied to the Arapaho return to their homeland. After several investigations into the massacre, the military siege was admonished and resulted in the Treaty of the Little Arkansas in 1865. That agreement was soon reneged upon. The U.S. government took back 90% of the reservation land. In the aftermath of the Sand Creek Massacre, Cheyenne and Arapaho tribal refugees were scattered from their traditional homeland to other reservations. The southern bands of Arapaho and Cheyenne were pushed to Concho, Oklahoma. The northern Cheyenne ended up in Lame Deer, Montana, and the northern Arapaho on the Wind River Reservation that they share with the eastern Shoshone tribe. After the tribes were split, the route taken from Colorado by the Arapaho and Cheyenne is now known as the Sand Creek Massacre Trail. Regardless, the southern and northern Arapaho are still culturally bound together by language and religious ceremonies like the Sundance, with frequent travel mostly by the southern Arapaho who transport themselves to and from Wyoming. What if there was a place for the Arapaho to meet midway in Colorado? Over the past couple decades, there have been some cultural activities in Boulder as attempts to forge stronger relations between the Arapaho and the Boulder Valley. The affected tribes, because of their traditional presence in the Boulder Valley, are working with local governments to write a management plan about the Fort Chambers site, including how the land could be repatriated.
It's one thing to drive down I-25 on the interstate and point over there and say this is where we used to live, but it's another thing just being right there at the location. And it's very moving and it's very spiritual. It's like it's embedded in our DNA, you know, that feeling that you get.
If anybody wants to go down there and pray, you know, they can set up sweat lodges, set aside some patch of land there for religious purposes. all of a sudden, after all these times, and all of a sudden he said, hey, you come down to your homeland and whatnot. But why? Something I haven't quite figured out yet.
And I was fortunate today that not only did you bring the northern and the southern back together, but I was able to introduce one of our northern relatives, a descendant from Chief Black Bear, to my mother and sisters and cousins and brothers. We're descendants from Six Feathers, which is Six Feathers and Black Bear were brothers. We didn't know about each other till a couple of years ago. I knew we had relatives. I knew we had to have relatives. And so it was just good to see the hugs, that blood is there.
Me and my dad, we take my sick brother to Denver. We started here at Riverton. Boulder was a place where they picked choke cherries. There was a lot of choke cherries there. He called it Bibinotina. That's the name of it in Arapaho. Bibinotina, where you pick choke cherries. Bibinotina, that's the name of Boulder. Around that area, he said, he was telling me about where there was some kind of militia there. He said, it wasn't cavalry. He said they were the ones that actually had done a Sand Creek Massacre there.
According to Gary Collins, the massive reservation land base with abundant water is an important resource that adds to a stable economy. That strength can bolster efforts to foster stronger relationships in Colorado.
We've been working on the agricultural program for the last 25 years, so I'm currently establishing what's called the Wind River Indian Reservation Conservation District, which allows for a lot of cooperation and coordination with federal and state entities to develop the lands in an appropriate manner. So I'm very optimistic. I just my caveat is that I live long enough to do that.
People from the south, Arapahos from the north, we come together because we've been asked to be here. And I would like to just remind us that due to the fact of the hard work of Right Relationship Boulder and church organizations and other ones that has been our feet and our hands and our voices while we're in Wyoming or we're in Oklahoma.
We can determine where the fort was, then that will be, in my mind and vision, make that, develop it so that it can be an educational portion, not for just the city of Boulder, but the state, and for national reasons because of it being tied to Sand Creek.
Some tribal members believe that anything short of giving the land back is nothing more than a well-intended gesture.
If Boulder really wants to give land back to the Arapaho tribe, give us a title. No conditions, no provenance policies. We don't need to have somebody watching over our shoulder. We know how to take care of the land.
Others think that land ceded back with conditions is a good step forward.
The way I see it is you just give it outright, but here's how you should kind of use it for the benefit of the tribe. But again, we don't want to go against their wishes of saying, well, sole purpose is to get it back and use it now in a more cultural appropriate way.
Our whole history, and we need to reconnect with our land, and our children need to hear our stories. That way they can make that connection, and it's all about healing, spiritual healing for our tribe.
There are traditional Arapaho stories about the Arapaho returning to Colorado.
We'll make our way back down where we belong sometimes, he said. That was his wish anyway, you know. Maybe he thought that way. I said, Grandpa, we're gonna stay here forever. I said, no, we're not. I said, you watch, he said.
Interact with the people, teach the people, share the lives of this community, of what was here before, who was here before.
That would benefit not only the people, not only our tribe members, but other tribes that are here and the general public, that could tell the story of who we are and what happened to us and where we're at now and where do we want to go.
This is our home. This is our home, and it's not our ancestral homelands like, that's what everybody refers to it as. It's our real home, that was granted to us by our Creator. We were told to come here and where to come, and that's why we were here for so long, is because we were in the right place.
Moving beyond Sand Creek hasn't been easy, but the strong community partnership with Right Relationship Boulder, facilitating the ongoing effort, means the Arapaho return will be sooner than later.
So that area down there is supposed to be where we belong.